Hello and thanks for joining us on The Conversation in New Central Television. This is the program where we bring you up to speed with all the political happenings on the African continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa.
And I am Rita Omodia. Now, today on The Conversation, we will be looking at the ongoing 17th meeting of Group of 720, that is the G20 summit hosted in Bali, Indonesia, where President Paul Kagame of Rwanda in his address emphasized that Africa just wants peace, not taking sides in the Ukraine war.
And in Liberia, the finance minister has said the president is entitled to $2,000 daily allowance during his current controversial overseas trip that includes a stop in Qatar for 9 days to watch his son in the FIFA World Cup, who plays for the United States of America. This brought about critics of the ruling party accusing President George Weah of going against the promise of reducing public spending in favor of his pro-poor agenda. Interesting times in Africa.
Well, I must say that there's always a special interest for George Weah going in terms of football. I mean, he just wants to watch.
Yes, but he's the president of a country. Are you going to abandon? We know, I mean, he's an African football legend. He's the only African that has won the Ballon d'Or. But you're not going to abandon your constitutional duties just to go and watch your son. Your son doesn't even play for Liberia.
Well, it's still part of diplomatic ties. I mean, he might just want to meet some other heads of state.
His handlers have said, you know, that there are going to be benefits from this. So we wait to see the benefits he'll bring back from Qatar.
Definitely. And talking about benefits right now, we go to the G20 summit where Rwandan President Paul Kagame has bemoaned the effects of the war in Ukraine and Africa, declaring that the continent wants peace in the world. Now, Kagame, who was addressing the G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia on Tuesday in his capacity as chairperson of the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, heads the state and government orientation committee, said, in quote, "What Africa wants to see is peace. We are confident that we cannot be accused of taking sides simply by asking for peace. Africa is here for Africa and our productive relationship with the rest of the world," end of quote. Kagame also highlighted that Africa had specific challenges made worse by external factors such as the war in Ukraine, and that too often our people are left to pay the price.
Now, climate change, the war in Ukraine and conflicts in Africa are the major drivers of the widening gap between developing and developed countries. This has led to even more debt for the continent. G20 leaders met for a two-day summit on 15th to 16th of November, hosted by the Indonesian G20 presidency in the island resort of Bali. Under the theme Recover Together, Recover Stronger, the G20 leaders discussed, among other topics, the three priorities of Indonesia's G20 presidency: global health, architecture, digital transformations, and sustainable energy transitions. Now, joining us live on today's conversation, we have Emeritus Professor Mukesh Kapila of the University of Manchester and a former United Nations official. We also have Global Affairs and African Affairs Analyst, Dr. David Matsanga. They both join us live from the United Kingdom. A warm welcome to you, gentlemen, and thanks for joining us on The Conversation.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for keeping us updated on African issues and global issues. I thank you.
You're welcome. I'd like to start with Professor Kapila. Formed in 1999, every year the G20 members, a group of 20 most industrialized nations in the world, they meet to discuss economic and financial matters, and there are not so many Africans there. The African leaders go on the sidelines, you know, to negotiate and discuss issues of importance to their countries or the continent. Of what benefits has the G20 since its inception been for the African continent, or are we always going to be on the sidelines?
Well, the G20 is really a club of the biggest economies. And, we have the United Nations. So, but clearly the United Nations, which is an inclusive club of all countries, is clearly not up to the taste of this selected group. So we had the G7, which became the G8, and now the G8 has become the G20. And by and large, I think this is a club that looks after the self-interest of these 20 countries to the extent that they can agree on anything. So I'm afraid that this is not necessarily the forum whereby the interests of Africa are going to be central to the discussions that have taken place at the summit, unfortunately.
Well, you have the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is present there. You also have President Paul Kagame. So why do they bond jet fuel to go all the way to Indonesia if their interests are not going to be met, or is it just a jamboree?
Yes, it's not to say that we don't have African representation on the G20, but it's still an extremely selective forum, and by and large, it's a very pragmatic forum. It depends on the prevailing geopolitics. It depends also on the individual bilateral interests of the countries represented, be they from Africa or be they from any other continent. That's why it's still a good forum. It's still better to talk than not to talk, if you like, and to talk informally, which is very often what the summits are about. But to be honest, they are still, it all depends on what happens to be the politics of the day. And of course, Africa, having taken a neutral position on the Ukraine crisis, more or less, there's clearly a tension between the African continent and the Western powers that are the dominant players on the G20.
Okay, now, Dr. Matsanga is still looking at the interest for African countries. Now, at the core of the G20 partnership with Africa lies the 2017 Compact with Africa. That is the CWA initiative brokered by Germany in 2017. Now, this was to focus on attracting more private investment to Africa, especially for infrastructure projects. Now, at that time, we had some countries criticize the CWA's focus large physical infrastructure over investments in human capital. Now, what has been the level of economic cooperation between the G20 states and African countries? Or has there been no level of economic cooperation so far?
There has been very low economic cooperation. And I agree with Professor Mukesh that it is a club of the interested people. They know each other. First of all, Africa is one continent where they take all this wealth, and they have taken the wealth. Now we go to beg the wealth. We go them and ask them, please give us something. But they have not got any guts to say, well, here we are, we give you money to build infrastructure. Instead, the money that they give us, they even put on interest. They tell IMF to put interest on us. They tell World Bank to give us conditions. But most of the resources were taken out of Africa. So I agree totally with the prof that this is a club of self-interest. It's a club of the people who think that they can master the world and do what they want. So for me, an African head of state going there, what is he going to achieve? What will they bring? When it came to COVID-19, Africa remained behind. They gave us second-hand material that they had used before. The medicine was given that it remained a remainder, take it to Africa, a remnant. That is how we are. There is no equality here. There is no equality in this. When you try to bring something like the BRICS, and you also call a meeting for BRICS, they sabotage it. So why is it that they want theirs to succeed? And for us, we go there to glorify. They want to draw us into an agenda which is not ours. And I agree with Kagame 100%. We want peace more than you drawing us whether we should go that side or that side. We are not interested. We have more wars on the continent of Africa than the Ukrainian war. But nobody is putting in money. Donors are not sitting down to put money in some war-torn areas where Africa is suffering.
Thank you, Dr. Matsanga. And I'm happy you mentioned the conflicts in Ukraine. Now, Professor Kapila, in October, 26 African countries voted in favor of a UN resolution rejecting Moscow's contentious referendums in 4 Ukrainian regions that it declared part of Russia, while 19 abstained. The ambassador of the United States of America to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, seemed to suggest that, you cannot, that this is a black and white case, that neutrality and abstaining from voting in this case was a it was almost a vote for Russia. She was basically saying that, you know, if you abstain, it means you voted for Russia. Why do we get this sort of statements from Western diplomats? And does it suggest that African countries do not have the agency to decide if they want to be neutral or not? Must we pick a side?
If that question is for me, I'm not necessarily sure I heard everything because I think the reception is not so good today down the line.
I can repeat.
I think.
Yes.
I think when it comes to hugely complicated questions like wars and conflicts, this one we're talking about is Ukraine. Africa has got a dilemma. On one hand, it is a conflict in a faraway continent somewhere else between two nations, which both are relevant to Africa, but it's not necessarily central to Africa's interest. But on the other hand, if Africa wants to take its place in the global order of things, then it should have a position on important issues of war and peace. So being neutral is not necessarily a position. It doesn't mean to say it needs to support one side or the other, but it does need to have a principled position on the issues underlying the Ukraine conflict, as indeed all the other conflicts that there might be. So to that extent, I think Africa and African countries need to have a more kind of proactive foreign policy rather than trying to make a balance between different competing interests.
Okay, I'm going to take you on that, but I'll throw that question to Dr. Matsanga. Now, do you feel the African countries are divided? Do you think that the African countries should stand together and pick a side to this whole issue? And do you have a problem with African countries abstaining, all those who abstain? Because we had 19 countries abstaining from this particular vote.
First of all, when you talk about African countries, talk about individual countries. First, we are not united at all. The African Union is broken into the French-speaking and the English-speaking. The African Union of today is not united. And let me tell you frankly, as an African who has followed all these things for a long time, the African Union of the past of Sekou Touré and the rest and is different from the African Union of Dr. Muhammad Faki. Dr. Muhammad Faki, as soon as he came to power, he took African Union to the French. We have no say in African Union. Wars take place on this continent. We don't speak with one voice in the United Nations. We have no, to be very honest, the confusion comes when you see African Union not whipped to talk together. And that is the divide and rule tactic that we see. And they threaten us with sanctions. I'm happy with Kagame's statement that we are not interested in what has happened. Yes, we agreed human rights abuses are taking place. But what is it that a war which is being fought 10,000 miles away from us on the continent, why should we be subjected to that war? If you don't support it, there are sanctions on you. This is all caused by the African Union disunity. African Union is a building left as a memorial building, but the people working inside, like a Dr. Muhammad Faki, is a sellout.
Okay. Now I'd like to bring in Professor Kapila. Professor Kapila, the man that said, don't let us pick sides here, President Paul Kagame in Faroe Bali, Indonesia, is accused of supporting M23 rebels that are closing in on Goma in the eastern DRC, and the displacement, this conflict has led to the displacement of over 230,000 people. As the former head of the United Nations mission in Sudan, you also have MONUSCO there. Why is the United Nations, the African Union, why is no one doing anything on this conflict? Because every day that the fighting intensifies. And there's evidence that, the M23 rebels are being supported from Kigali, but it seems Rwanda is untouchable.
Sorry, I'm afraid I'm not hearing you very, very clearly, so I didn't get your core question. Can you repeat, or can someone repeat very briefly?
Okay, what can African Union and the world do about the M23 rebels? Because you have MONUSCO, the United Nations Stabilization Mission in the Congo, right there, but M23 rebels are closing in on Goma. What needs to be done to bring about lasting peace to the Eastern DRC? Okay, I'll just direct that question to Dr. Matsanga while we work on Professor Kapila's audio connection.
First of all, thank you very much. The war in Eastern Congo is one of the most complicated wars. It has sucked in 11 countries. It's not one country, it's 11 countries with 132 rebel groups on the ground, on the territory of Congo. One of the things why this war has been elusive, why the peace has been elusive, is because people don't talk the truth. African leaders are becoming liars.
What's the truth in this situation, Dr. Matsanga? What's the truth?
The truth is that come on table and say, I am the one, I want the territory of Congo, I am the one funding the rebels, I'm the one arming the rebels, I'm the one equipping them. But there is no need of coming on the table on the peace process. Some of us have followed the Ethiopian way. You see, the Ethiopian crisis is over, it's almost over, because people were frank. They came out, I listened to the stories. But the one of Congo, people are not sincere. There are leaders there who are not sincere. And the time has come for us in Africa and Africa to call these guys out. We call them on national television, like this international television. Tell us, if these rebels strike Congo, where do they go? They must have a base. Who gives them uniforms? There must be somebody who is supplying them with uniforms. If we go on telling lies to international community, then the war can't end.
Okay, now, Dr. Matsanga, while we're looking at Rwandan President Paul Kagame, who is also complicit in his own wars with DRC and Rwanda, now he says Africa not taking sides in Russia. But unfortunately, African countries, Africans are still bearing the brunt. Now, recently, a 23-year-old Zambian student who was convicted in Russia and served a prison sentence on the outskirts of Moscow was found dead in combat in Ukraine. Now, as much as we do not want to take sides or we do not want to bother about the issues and we just want peace, are Africans now used for combat in exchange for amnesty or better living? And how should such issues be handled?
I think one of the things that we should do, thank you very much, Rita. One of the things that we should do is Africa to come back and capture African Union and create African unity. Because most of our people are going out to look for money because of the poverty. The Zambian that was caught in Russia and then found on the front line dead, it's because he wanted money. It's poverty. We are being told that there's illegal immigrants in UK, in Europe, because people leave Africa due to the conditions that are on the ground. So what we should do is to stand up and tell the world that this war is yours. And actually, the Ukrainian war is theirs. They have the might. It might not end today. It will not end. It's a protracted struggle. As we see on people going to knock Poland, which is a NATO country, under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, if you knock one country, you are supposed to be attacked. So why should Africa be dragged in this? We need peace, yes, Rita, but how do we get out of the quagmire? The question you have asked is very important. How do we get out? Because we Africans are not united on one stand. If you bring a vote, look at the men who ran away from voting. And at night they call them that Russia, we did not want to vote. And then they call the United States, we did not want to vote. Please, we don't want to be involved. We have people who, in fact, I don't like President of Eritrea at all. But I like him on when it comes. He's my friend. We are together in the same office in London. But when it comes to voting, vote straight. That's a good country. It says, I am
they
not
never
with
stand
you.
on the fence. Dr. Matsanga, I'd like to bring in Professor Kapila here. Professor Kapila, can you hear us? Hello, Professor Kapila, can you hear us? Okay, we still have audio connection issues with Professor Kapila. Now, Dr. Matsanga, one of my favorite quotes is from African revolutionary leader, the late Captain Thomas Sankara. He says, "He who feeds you controls you." So we have a situation where over 100 countries have requested emergency assistance from the International Monetary Fund since the beginning of the pandemic in 2022. IMF is lending to distressed economies a record high $140 billion. So he who feeds you controls you. We know how the IMF works. It's and all the Bretton Woods institutions with the stringent conditions attached to this aid. So in what ways can Africa be economically independent and not, run to Europe or other places for bailouts?
First of all, I like that quote from Sankara. It's true. But I also want to give you a quote from Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah told the Africans that please seek political unity and the economic unity will fall in place. Africans have never listened to that quote of Nkrumah. Every African has taken his own route. Now that is where the rubber meets the rubber meets the road.
Yes.
That we are found in catch 22. We are fed by, we ask for loans from these same people. And we fear to condemn them when they do bad things. For example, they did quite a lot. Tony Blair, for example, was sent troops to Iraq. And the Iraqi was erased down. And he came back and told us, oh my God, the document that I used to fight Saddam Hussein were fake. So, but this is the same leader we are agreeing. Today you see Tony Blair with a tie running around Africa seeking consultants. Nobody has cautioned Tony Blair in the United Kingdom here where I am, that it must be accountability because people have died. So Africa, we have a problem until we get political integration, political unity. We start talking ourselves. That is when we shall have that will to say, I don't want your food. But for now, we are caught in the web of food being given to us by IMF and the World Bank.
Okay, well, we're still caught in the web of this IMF debacle from COVID-19 pandemic and the wars going on. Now, Rwandan President Paul Kagame pleaded with the G20 to reintroduce debt write-offs and for more support from the International Monetary Fund through its Resilience and Sustainability Trust. Now, we're in this quagmire. Professor Kapila, do you think this will be granted, this debt write-offs? And is this actually a sustainable solution for Africa?
I think certainly there should be more debt relief given out, considering the extremely special circumstances of the last few years, especially because of COVID, and now, of course, we have climate change. And Africa has done very well in terms of its economic growth policies in many, many different countries. I'm actually quite optimistic that the economic circumstances will probably be reflected in some kind of deal that will give Africa more resources, especially in the context of climate change. Climate change, changes everything.
Now, quickly, Professor Kapila, India is going to host the next G20, and there's been a lot of clamor for African Union to have a permanent seat at the G20. Now, is there any possibility of that, quickly?
Well, I think, yes, there is a possibility of that. I think, the argument that Africa needs more of a voice in all the global fora that you can think of, whether it's the Security Council, which we've talked about before on this program, and elsewhere, that voice has been heard. The problem is, who is to represent Africa? Should it be the African Union as an institution? Should these other fora? They're not institutions of organizations. They are fora for member states. And until Africa gets its act together in terms of who is going to represent Africa beyond the African Union, it's going to be split on this particular issue. So there's a lot of work to be done domestically in Africa so as to increase representation more globally.
Thank you, Professor Kapila. Dr. Matsanga, before we wrap up this conversation, 64% of EU's bauxite imports come from Guinea, 68% of cobalt and 36% of tantalum comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 71% of platinum from South Africa. We do know how important these resources are to the global supply chain and manufacturing of gadgets that everybody uses. But you look at the DRC today, it's one of the poorest countries in the world on all indices of human development. So how can Africa change its story from, the resource basket of the world to a more productive one? And how can we make sure that these resources are more beneficial for the people? I know it's easy to say, colonialism. You look at a country like Equatorial Guinea, per capita, should be close to Switzerland, but you have a situation where you have a head of state that's been there for 40 years, a small population, but its resources had not been shared amongst the people. So how do we balance it? There are some cases where, there's exploitation, and there's some cases that it's just plain greed from the leaders. So what's your take on this, Dr. Matsanga?
First of all, that's a very good question. And if you want to understand the problems of Africa, you read the book of Chinua Achebe by The Anthills of Savannah. You will find the Anthills of Savannah. I think you will find one in Lagos in the library around there, or bookshop. I would like you to look at that book. Chinua Achebe was right. I read it in 1974, and I still have it in my head. These African leaders have a problem. They look at the one of Cameroon. He wants another term. Look at that one of Equatorial Guinea. He wants another term. Look, we have a problem. The anthills of Savannah came to bite us now. Where are the anthills? These are the anthills. You find a country so poor, yet very rich. Democratic Republic of Congo is a very rich country, but it has been fighting since 1961. Why? You see, when you blame colonialism, how long will you blame colonialism? Every party that comes in the Democratic Republic of Congo should actually stand up and say, a leader like Tshisekedi should tell people to get out of his country, should mobilize resources. Instead, he joins the plundering system of using the same rebel groups to plunder and also to make money. So we have a problem here. Until Africa starts to unite politically, integrate politically, start removing barriers, start having people going into countries without any form of restriction, the ants of Savannah will come and bite us. Chinua Achebe was right.
Thank you very much, Dr. David Matsanga. A fine place to go on a break. Thank you, Professor Kapila, for being a part of this conversation. We do appreciate your insights and your time. Thank you.